The most important question every American parent must answer that I never hear them ask. What school district will they attend? How much can we put aside in savings each month for their college? Are they spending too much time playing video games or immersed in social media? These are very important questions that parents ask about their children, but there is one question that is even more central to their children's future, and it is, upon the birth of your child, would you walk into a bank and take out a $54,000 loan in your child's name, then spend the money on yourself, leaving your child to pay back the loan when they grow up? If you answered no, or possibly even a stronger answer, you should know something. You've already done this very thing. At the time of this filming, our national debt sits at just over $17 trillion. Our population currently sits at just over 300 million. This means that each man, woman, and child in the United States owes just over $54,000 as their share of the national debt. Each of your children owes $54,000 for a debt they had no say in nor any control over. That money's already spent, and most of it was spent in the last 13 years by you and me. In looking at a brief history of our national debt, you will see that our first 42 presidents, from George Washington all the way to Bill Clinton, over the course of 212 years, accumulated a total national debt of $5.8 trillion. This is, of course, too much, but look what's happened with just our last two presidents. Republican George W. Bush, upon taking office, our debt was at $5.8 trillion. When he left office, our debt had increased to $10.6 trillion. An increase of $4.8 trillion in just 8 years. Bush nearly doubled a national debt that took more than 200 years to accumulate. Not to be outdone, Democrat Barack Obama, upon taking office, our debt was at $10.6 trillion. Our current debt sits at $17.3 trillion, an increase of $6.7 trillion in just 5 years. And of course, President Obama isn't done adding to that debt yet, as he is still in office. By the time Obama leaves office, our last two presidents will have more than tripled our national debt. And since most of us have been taxpayers that long, we are the ones who spent most of that money. That $54,000 share of our national debt that each of our children are inheriting, and that share increases every day, will severely limit their economic choices. They won't be able to afford the same careless decisions we have made. But who's to blame for this debt madness we are leaving our children? Bush? Obama? Politicians of both parties? No. Who's to blame? We have no one to blame but ourselves, the people of the United States of America. It is your fault. It is my fault. And before we can ever solve our debt madness and salvage some decent future for our children, we must first accept that we are to blame. We elected the legislators and presidents that have spent all this borrowed money. We asked for the unsustainable government entitlements and supported the endless wars that are tripling our national debt. Republicans blame Democrats, Democrats blame Republicans, and ambivalent independents blame the government if they even care. But we are the government. Did you know that in their wisdom, our founders anticipated this possible debt madness? Let's look at what they did and we undid that would have prevented this disaster. Our founders made disproportionate federal taxes illegal. They were originally banned under our Constitution to limit the taxing and spending powers of the federal government. After any comprehensive reading of our founders' writings, or the Federalist Papers, or de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which warned us of the tyranny of the majority, you come away with an understanding that limiting the taxing powers of the federal government is crucial to preserving liberty and fiscal discipline. It was known that disproportionate taxation would lead to massive government spending once politicians learned they could win elections by bribing voters through redistributing the wealth of the rich. This constitutional ban, with a brief interruption in the Civil War, acted as a powerful and necessary limit to our federal government for over 100 years. While I strongly recommend each American read the works listed here, we will cover just a few quotes that support the notion that our founders opposed what is our current tax system. If we can but prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them, they must become happy. Thomas Jefferson. Good intentions will always be pleaded for every assumption of authority. It is hardly too strong to say that the Constitution was made to guard the people against the dangers of good intentions. Daniel Webster. To take from one because it is thought that his own industry and that of his fathers has acquired too much in order to spare to others is to violate arbitrarily the first principle of association, the guarantee to everyone of a free exercise of his industry and the fruits acquired by it. Thomas Jefferson. A government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. George Bernard Shaw. That quote always intrigued me because although Shaw was an avid socialist, he was quite honest about the political advantages of a disproportionate taxation system. And finally, from Milton Friedman, we have a system that increasingly taxes work and subsidizes non-work. This quote is especially relevant in light of the recent CBO report that states Obamacare will enable millions of people to stop working because their health care will be subsidized by others who do work. If graduated income taxes were originally illegal under the Constitution, how are they now the primary source of federal taxation? The answer is because after years of legal battles, the big spenders got their wish and we enacted the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1913. The 16th Amendment removed the constitutional restrictions placed upon our federal government with regards to taxing power. From this chart, you can see the devastating effect the 16th Amendment has had on our federal government spending. After the 16th Amendment, our politicians were free to buy the votes of the 51% by taking from the 49%. Just taking from our own rich soon wasn't good enough, though. Our greed for government spending quickly leached into the pockets of our children, as we don't just tax to spend anymore, we also borrow. We, the people of the United States of America, now borrow about 30 to 40 cents of every dollar our federal government spends. For obvious reasons, this can't continue much longer without a complete economic meltdown. We have faced the reality of our debt madness and accepted responsibility. Now what? I hope you agree that we must start cutting. This is not a political opinion, but rather an economic necessity to begin freeing our children from the servitude to debt we have placed them in. Where do we start cutting? On the chart in the upper right corner, you will see that in recent years, we have indeed borrowed as much as 43 cents of every dollar our federal government spends, and there is no end in sight to this unsustainable debt. On the pie chart in the bottom left, you see the President's proposed total spending for fiscal year 2014. Note the three largest pieces of the pie, and the vast majority of our total spending are comprised of government entitlements such as Social Security, unemployment, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., as well as military spending. Also note, we spend 6% of our total budget just paying the interest on the debt we have already accumulated, but only 4% to our veterans' benefits. Which do you think is more important? That interest payment will eat up more of our budget every year if we don't stop borrowing now. Notice the table in the bottom right corner. Our projected budget for 2014 is $3,800 billion, or $3.8 trillion if you prefer. Just to break even for this year, we would have to eliminate 30% of that pie chart for a total of $1,140 billion. Often when politicians are cornered, all they will really pledge to is cutting the waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. To take away an intangible argument that often dissuades real cutting, I have included the largest estimate for annual government waste, fraud, and abuse, which is $250 billion a year. Even if we eliminated every penny of that waste, that would only total 22% of the needed cuts. The scope of our spending problem is daunting. That's undeniable. But if you think it is too much to tackle, pause this video, take a break, hug your children, and remember, each of them owes that $54,000 that we already spent. We owe it to them to start tackling this issue now. One reason to take personal ownership of this issue as a citizen is not to feel guilty, but because it helps you to see why the partisan bickering of both parties is only hurting us, while the spending grows ever more out of control. To show you what I mean, let's analyze what we normally hear from the two major parties on the subject of cutting federal spending. If you are a Democrat, you probably want to raise taxes on the rich and corporations, eliminate those dirty energy fossil fuel subsidies, and lower military spending. We certainly must eliminate dirty energy subsidies, but we will address that proposal further in the next slide. As for raising taxes on the rich, note the table in the upper right corner. According to a CBO report released last December, the top 40% of American wage earners pay 106% of all federal income taxes. This means that they pay 6% more in tax revenue than the government even keeps, while the bottom 40% of wage earners pay negative 8% of federal income taxes because they receive more back in refunds than they even pay in to begin with. There is no room to tax the rich more. They already pay all the taxes. With regards to taxing corporations more, please note the table in the bottom right. Of all developed nations, the United States has the highest corporate income tax rate at 40%, the highest in the world. Two countries we often think of being even bigger government countries than the United States, France and Canada, have much lower corporate tax rates at 33% and 26%. The global average is only 25%. China, a communist country, is at only 25%. And you wonder why they're so successful. Sweden, a socialist country, has a corporate tax rate of only 22%, and Russia is at only 20%. Do you really want to make our nation even less friendly to corporate investment than our global competitors? It's no wonder we are driving corporate money and jobs overseas. Needless to say, we can't increase a tax rate that is already the highest in the world. Furthermore, and this is important, there really is no such thing as a corporate income tax. Think about it. To a corporation, a tax is a cost of doing business. As such, it is directly added onto the price of the goods or services produced. As consumers, we pay for that tax in the form of higher prices. Therefore, corporate income taxes are really just consumer taxes. Other nations know this, and that's the reason they keep their rates so much lower. Regarding military spending, yes, we absolutely must cut military spending. It's the third largest piece of that pie. But note that even if we completely eliminated our entire military, that would barely be half the total cuts we must make. Without serious entitlement cuts as well, we will never end our debt madness. How about the Republicans then, that party of fiscal responsibility? If you are a Republican, you probably want to cut government entitlements, eliminate those green energy subsidies, and lower tax rates to stimulate economic growth and increase tax revenues. Green energy subsidies, in fact all energy subsidies, must be eliminated. It doesn't matter what our opinion is about these industries, we can't afford it. It is worth noting the massive disparity between fossil fuel subsidies and renewable energy subsidies. In the chart at the upper right, you will see that fossil fuel subsidies cost us $69 for every billion BTUs produced, which is a stunning bargain compared to renewable subsidies, which cost us $1,724 per billion BTUs produced. Private businesses should be free to invest all they want in any energy sources, but don't force the taxpayer to make people and green energy companies rich through subsidies and bailouts at our children's expense. If you look at our recurring pie chart, it is impossible not to notice that government entitlements make up far more than half our government spending. Yes, government entitlement cuts must be a major part of ending our debt madness. If we keep refusing to face this issue, those programs will bankrupt us and cease to exist. No one will be helped by them at that point. Entitlement cuts can't make up all of our budget cuts, however. Military spending is such a large piece of that pie, it must be cut as well, along with just about every piece of that pie. If we don't spread the cuts around, they will never happen. But more on the military cuts in a moment. Republicans often suggest we lower tax rates to stimulate economic growth and increase tax revenues. It is absolutely true, mathematically and historically, that lower tax rates increase economic growth to the point that they actually increase tax revenue. To graphically represent this, I have included what's known as the Laffer curve. Google it and study it yourself if you have time. It isn't nearly as complicated as it looks. The curve shows how, as tax rates increase, starting in the lower left-hand corner of the graph, both economic growth and tax revenues increase. The tax rate at which economic growth is maximized is represented by the first dot on the graph. After that point, economic growth starts to taper off, but tax revenues continue to increase from a still robust economic growth until we reach a rate where tax revenues themselves peak. That is the second dot on the graph. And that's where you want tax rates to be. It maximizes and balances tax revenues with economic growth. Any further increase in tax rates after that point actually causes declining tax revenues. This is just common sense. If you are a business owner or investor, once the risk of expansion or investment outweighs the potential reward, you will stop expanding and investing. You will act in the best interest of yourself and your family just like anyone else. So yes, we could stand some lower taxes. Our economy and our tax revenues would benefit. Before praising Republicans too much, though, let us remember that when the Republican-controlled House brought a balanced budget amendment up for a vote in November of 2011, they were unable to pass it when they didn't require a single Democrat's vote for it to pass. They couldn't get enough Republicans to agree to the amendment. In actual practice, despite their rhetoric, the national leadership of the Republican Party has been all flash and no cash when it comes to serious spending cuts. One more point on military spending before we move on, because I know that can be the most difficult cut for fiscal conservatives to embrace. In 2011, the United States spent more than the next 13 nations combined on its military. That's just a fact. Remember for whom these cuts must be made. We can still cut safely, but they will have to sacrifice their safety when they are forced to cut. We have been a great, proud, and prosperous nation. Not only can we reduce military spending without harming our national defense, we must. In order to keep our promises to those who have already honorably served, and to preserve the safety of future generations, we must do more with less. Now let us turn the page and the corner and look at some positive steps we could take now to reduce our national debt. Positive steps we could take now to stop the debt madness. Balanced budget amendment. We must make it more difficult for our federal government to borrow money in our name. Whether it be to require a greater majority, or whether it be to require an official declaration of war by Congress, or whether it be in some other form, we must have a system in place to make our legislators more accountable for their spending. A simple debt ceiling vote, which has become a farce in recent years, no longer suffices as an adequate deterrent to massive government borrowing. Legislative term limits. Congressional term limits are so logical, it's hard to see why they aren't already in place. Unless it is because politicians don't want their lifelong pork-field meal ticket taken away. The argument against term limits usually consists of some version of the following. If our founders had wanted term limits, they would have included them in the Constitution. Ironically, this is one of the few times you will hear Democrats advocate for a constructionist view of the Constitution. The reality is that the size and power of our federal government now dwarfs the founders' wildest nightmares, or they would have included term limits. We must return to citizen volunteer representatives who leave their full-time professions to temporarily serve their fellow Americans in Congress. The temptation for corruption, payoffs, and personal greed is far too strong without term limits, and surely attracts some politicians for all the wrong reasons. Line item veto. A line item veto would give our president the power to veto specific items in an appropriations bill without vetoing the entire bill. Countless billions in federal taxpayer funds are spent on localized projects solely to bring money back to a politician's district to assist in their re-election or to pay back donors and supporters through government contracts. We usually refer to this as pork barrel spending. The line item veto is needed to give the president the power to veto these pork barrel projects. For instance, savvy legislators often attach pork barrel spending to bills that fund our troops or fund school lunches or some other popular issue, so that if a concerned president vetoes the entire bill because of the pork, he will be massacred in the press. Last October's crucial bill that was just supposed to fund the government and raise the debt ceiling also included billions in pork, including a $2.2 billion bridge in Mitch McConnell's Kentucky and $450 million for rebuilding projects in Mark Udall's Colorado. Some worry that a line item veto gives our president too much power. I can see that argument, but I feel it will make the president more accountable for spending by taking away the excuse that a president can't cut spending without cutting the entire bill. I feel it is at least worth a temporary trial period. Flat income tax. We have already seen the damage the graduated income tax has done to our nation and our children's future by enabling massive and unsustainable levels of government spending and debt. Our current tax system is also full of complex regulations and loopholes that play favorites with some Americans and companies while penalizing others. This is not the job of the federal government. A federal income tax should be a flat tax. No loopholes, no deductions, no complex regulations, no bulky and corrupt IRS. Let's say it's put at 10%. If you make $10 billion, you pay $1 billion. If you make $10,000, you pay $1,000. This is the key. If every American has a stake in keeping tax rates low and spending down, if the re-election of every federal politician requires it, tax rates will stay low and spending will come down. End government subsidies of private business. Our federal government has no business picking winners and losers in a free market. They only artificially increase prices by subsidizing inefficient companies for political reasons, and they directly created the environment which led to our housing bubble bursting, our financial sector crashing, and our recent Great Recession. Furthermore, when a private company fails, it should be allowed to fail. The investors will lose out, but the taxpayers won't have to fund a bailout. When companies are backed by taxpayer guarantees, bailouts are inevitable. People can make arguments that some industries or some companies should be subsidized for one reason or another. Frankly, we can't afford that argument anymore. It doesn't matter what our opinion is, the money isn't there. End foreign aid. While not a substantial amount of money compared to the 30% we must cut, it is a great place to start. It is absurd that a nation who has to borrow every year to pay its public bills turns around and hands a portion of that borrowed money to other countries. We take out the loan, we pay the interest, and they get to spend the money. No, those days should be over. For right now, foreign aid is another luxury we can't afford. Open public lands to reasonable energy production and make the United States an energy exporter. Economic growth is central to reducing spending. With recent advances in energy production, such as clean coal and hydraulic fracking, the United States has the potential to unlock and utilize its God-given natural resources to better the economic life of every American now and well into the future. While President Obama likes to take credit for our increased domestic oil production, this increase is on private lands, and he goes to great efforts to restrict any energy production on public lands and to destroy the coal industry altogether. Remember, it was President Obama who told us, under his plan, energy prices would necessarily skyrocket. With dramatically increased domestic energy production, every segment of our economy would improve. Countless jobs would be created, which would create wealth and demand for other goods and services, creating even more jobs without any taxpayer stimulus. With increased production, domestic energy prices would go down, which would lower the price of all goods by reducing the cost to produce and ship the goods. We should also remember, it is the poorest Americans who benefit from lower energy costs, as energy costs are a larger part of their budget, and they tend to own less energy-efficient homes, cars, and appliances. In addition, reducing our dependence on foreign energy, especially from terrorist nations, is a goal every American should support. I don't pretend that these are all of the answers. Do your own homework, add some more answers to the list. Some of these ideas might not be involved in the solution at all, but that's not what I care about most of all. What I care about, what you should care about, is ending this debt madness now before it is too late for the next generation of American taxpayers. All will seem stable until the moment it isn't. That's the way societies crumble, all at once and without warning. Republican and Democrat arguments don't matter anymore. We can no longer afford the luxury of argument. Finally, one last quote and one last graph. There is no nation on earth powerful enough to accomplish our overthrow. Our destruction, should it come at all, will be from another quarter, from the inattention of the people to the concerns of their government, from their carelessness and negligence. Daniel Webster. Let's make sure that that doesn't happen on our watch. This final graph is to remind us why and how each of our children is born owing $54,000. We have already mortgaged our children's economic future. If we don't act now to stop our debt madness, we will bankrupt them. That isn't a political opinion, but a mathematic inevitability. Just in the time it took you to watch this video, our national debt has increased by about $50 million and counting.